Imagine being a child on the freezing streets of 19th century New York. Your mother is dead, and your father, too poor to feed both you and your baby sister, sends you out to fend for yourself. Cold, hungry, and terrified, you stumble into an alley where other abandoned children huddle together for warmth. They teach you their ways, but survival is brief, and you're caught, thrown in jail, and before you know it, you're being told that you're taking a train ride to a better life far away from the only family you have left. This is the story of the Orphan Train, a journey of hope, despair, and the complex legacy of America's first child welfare experiment. Well, hello there. I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. I've been wanting to do a story on the orphan trains since I started this podcast. I grew up learning about them, and I was always fascinated by the stories of the children who rode these trains. And I even read a lot of fiction when I was a kid that was based around the riders. But I just recently learned that a large portion of American society has never even heard about the orphan trains. So I just couldn't wait any longer to talk about it. Let me know if you've heard of the orphan trains before or if you learned something new in today's episode. Now, to understand the origins of the orphan train, we have to look back at what was going on in the mid-19th century. This was a time when America was in the middle of massive transformation. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, drawing millions of people to urban centers like New York City in search of work and a better life. In the late 1840s, immigrants began arriving in New York by the thousands every single day. At that time, the immigrants were primarily coming from Ireland because of the Great Potato Famine, and Germany, where they were not only experiencing their own agricultural crisis, but also there was a wave of revolutions sweeping across Europe that had greatly affected Germany. And many Germans at that time were fleeing from political and religious persecution. As families migrated to the States, you had what was referred to as chain migration, where someone would migrate over, have great success, and they would write back to their friends and family, encouraging them to join them in the land of great opportunity, which they often did. And at that time, you also had shipping companies, land agents, and even individual states in America that were actively recruiting German immigrants to settle in the U.S. Companies and governments further promoted the idea that the United States was a land of unlimited opportunity where hardworking individuals would prosper. This marketing, combined with the genuine success stories of previous immigrants, motivated many Germans to take the risk of crossing the Atlantic. And by the 1950s, New York City was overflowing with these immigrants fleeing from famine, war, and poverty in their homelands. But the reality they found waiting for them was much harsher than they had imagined. New York City's infrastructure couldn't keep up with the pace of the growing population. This led to overcrowded tenements and America's very first slums. The living conditions in these areas were dire, and many families lived in extreme poverty. In order for families to survive, everyone had to work, including children, which wasn't uncommon during that time period, but the overcrowding meant there really weren't enough jobs to go around, even for the adults. Epidemics such as cholera and tuberculosis swept through the overcrowded city, leaving behind an increased number of orphans in their wake. Often, only one parent would die, but the other parent would be so overcome by the devastation of not being able to support their children on their own that they would give up or abandon at least some of their children or turn to alcohol, which of course further limited their ability to care for their children even more. The inability to feed their children was such a problem that the birth of a new child was often seen as a devastating event instead of the joyous occasion that it should have been. And it became commonplace for parents to leave their newborn infants on the steps of churches, police stations, or simply place them in the street to die. It's reported that the police would find at least one abandoned infant in the street every single day during this time period. Now, rather than abandon their new infant, some parents chose to simply kick their older children out of the home since they had a greater chance of surviving on their own. And often these older children were only about 6 or 7 years old. And the fact that children were working during this time actually added added to the problem because children were easy to take advantage of, and factories would often give jobs to children first because they knew that kids would be easier to control and that they could pay them less than adults. So not only did this mean that they were taking jobs away from adults, but also they were paid so little that the children still couldn't afford a place to live. These companies would often overwork these children to the point where they could no longer perform their duties, and then they would just toss them out and hire another kid off the street. So, as you can imagine, as the city's population exploded, so did the number of homeless and destitute children. At a time when New York's population was 500,000, police estimated that there were 10,000 homeless children living on the streets. In order to survive, many of these children formed street gangs, becoming quite a nuisance to society as they ran around fighting over turf, stealing, and begging in the streets. In 1849, the New York City Chief of Police wrote about what he called the constant increase in the number of vagrant, idle, and vicious children living in the streets. In response to their homeless children problem, the city began to build institutions, which nowadays we would call orphanages, but back then they called them almshouses, homes for little wanderers, and homes for destitute children. Unfortunately, these orphanages were so overcrowded and often such places of horror that children preferred to live on the streets rather than to be sent to one of these homes. These homes also had very strict rules, and they ran them more like prisons than homes for children. Punishments were harsh. They were always short on food and often withheld food from children as a form of punishment for disobedience to the strict rules of the home. So even if they were to live in one of these homes, children would often go hungry, and so why not live on the street where at least you had some type of freedom? Now, these homes were so terrible that the city even admitted to it. They wrote a report basically saying that stray animals were often treated better than the paupers were in these houses. It's estimated that by the mid-1850s, there were over 30,000 homeless children living on the streets of New York City alone. Now, if you've ever seen any of those old movies that are set back during this time period, you may be familiar with the newsboys that many of those movies depict. You know, it was those boys that were running around selling newspapers. They would always have these boys like on soapboxes, and they'd be yelling, "Extra, extra, read all about it." The movies always portrayed those newsboys as kind of like street gangs. They would work together and run this whole scam to pick people's pockets and stuff like that. Well, it turns out those newsboys were part of these groups that back then they would call street urchins, or the cops even refer to them as street rats. These kids were everywhere, and they really were quite a nuisance on society during this time, just how they were portrayed in the movies. But what were they supposed to do? I don't think they really had any other choice if they wanted to survive. During this harsh period of time, children were treated as adults at the age of 7. So when they were picked up by police for a crime, they would be thrown in jail with adults. Sometimes children as young as 5 years old would be put in prison with violent criminals. And by the age of 12, they could be hanged for stealing. These hangings were carried out publicly and in front of the other children in the street. Presumably, they did this maybe as a deterrent. But I mean, you die of hunger or you die because you stole someone's bread. Like, what were these kids supposed to do? It seemed like the city just kind of threw its hands up as thousands of vagrant children roamed the streets of lower Manhattan seeking food and shelter. They lived by their wits, sleeping in ash barrels, under doorsteps, in gutters or alleyways, and other out-of-the-way places, in and around a notorious slum called 5 Points. Violent gangs fought over turf in this neighborhood, which was known to have the highest murder rate of any slum in the world, where children continued to be forced to steal, beg, or do dangerous jobs to survive. Now, it's not something we like to think about, but some of these young kids resorted to prostitution to survive. Many of these children's only source of food was what they could find in a trash can. In 1853 alone, 800 children under the age of 15 and 4,000 under the age of 21 were arrested. Relief and social welfare agencies were unknown, and the city lacked resources for help. New York had the highest death rate of any major city in the world. Now, as often happens when the government falls short on its ability to take care of a situation, it falls to private citizens to take charge. And fortunately for the desolate children of New York, in the 1850s, their plight called the attention of a man by the name of Charles Loring Brace. Brace was a Protestant minister who was deeply troubled by the growing number of homeless children. Brace believed that these children, if left to their own devices, would inevitably fall into lives of crime and poverty. He saw them not just as victims, but as a potential threat to the moral fabric of society. However, he also acknowledged that this was not the fault of these children and that most of them truly had no other choice if they wished to survive. Now, just as a little side note, people in more recent years have tried to paint Brace out to be some sort of racist, like pretty much every other person who's been given props for making a positive contribution to society in the last 200 years. But there is documented proof that these accusations are unfounded. Brace was a known abolitionist whose ideas were way ahead of his time, even for an abolitionist. His uncle, who he was named after, was a lawyer and had defended a fugitive slave in court. Brace's father, John, had taught history at an all-girls school and was a firm believer in equal rights for women. He taught Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, she thought so highly of her beloved teacher that she named a character in one of her novels after him. And Brace even married into a family with similar beliefs. His father-in-law was a good friend to the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass and even hosted him in his home. During a time period when many people held the ridiculous belief that people's intellect was tied to their skin color, Brace wrote in his book that blacks and whites did not differ in their mental capacities, which, duh. But back then, there's some pretty cutting-edge stuff. Your boy was going against the grain. So, now that we got all that out of the way, born in 1826, Charles Loring Brace was raised in a devout Calvinist family. His mother died when he was just 14 years old, and his father, who was a history teacher, like I mentioned, homeschooled him until he attended Yale Divinity School, graduating as a top student. He then moved to New York to attend Union Theological Seminary. To support himself, Brace taught Latin and wrote articles with moral and religious themes for several publications, including the New York Daily Times. He loved exploring the city with his friend Frederick Law Olmsted, who later co-designed Central Park. Union Theological was a short walk to the Five Points slum district, as well as other neighborhoods known for being in abject poverty. And Brace was appalled at the misery he witnessed when conducting in-home visits or ministering to the sick as part of his seminary training. And he had a special concern for the thousands of vulnerable children he saw trying to survive in the worst of circumstances. And according to Miriam Z. Langsom's book, Children West, there were more than 40,000 homeless children living on the streets of New York by this point. After college, Charles had planned to serve as a minister in a church, but after his time serving the poor at a Methodist mission located in the slums of Five Points, Brace's heart had really become drawn to helping the poor. In 1852, at the age of 26, and seeing the great need of the children living on the streets, Brace decided that he could be of better use by helping poor children rather than waiting until they became adults to try and help them. Many of the people living in the city saw these boys as only trouble due to the lives of crime they were living and didn't think they were capable of change. Brace saw these children as victims of their environment, and he believed that if they were taken in, given a roof over their head, and plenty to eat, they could be shown a better way to live. During his time in seminary, Brace had taken a trip to Europe, where he had studied other methods of supporting and uplifting people in crisis. And what had really stuck out to him about that trip was a German orphanage that provided a home-like environment for children, instead of it being like a prison type of environment with strict rules and than harsh punishments like American orphanages, this German orphanage was set up with house parents, usually a theological student, who would take care of these children and treat them well. The children did have chores around the home, but they were also given time to play. The older children who had jobs were required to give a small amount of their income as payment for their care. Brace could see the stark contrast between the way these children were treated and how it affected their behaviors. He also noted that children in orphanages like the ones in the United States were much more likely to die from lack of care, and he wrote about how young babies needed an individual caretaker solely responsible for them if they were to survive. So after Brace decided that his mission in life was to help the poor, in 1853 he established the Children's Aid Society, or CAS, and this society was dedicated to improving the lives of impoverished children. In 1854, the society opened the first of its newsboys lodging houses. These houses have been described as the nation's first runaway shelter. They provided decent food, shelter, and hygiene, as well as job training and basic education. Brace acknowledged that people needed to be given a hand up and not just a hand out if they were ever going to truly better themselves. And it was for this reason that the boys were charged a very small rate for their room. It wasn't much since they didn't make much, but it gave them the ability to earn their own way. And the lodgers also had daily chores that they were responsible for around the house. These newsboys lodging houses were the best thing to have ever come along for homeless children on the streets of New York, but there were still just too many children for this to be a long-term solution. As soon as Brace would open a home, it would be filled. He would open another and it would be filled just as quickly. He became increasingly aware that he couldn't pay enough employees or build enough group homes to provide for all the vulnerable and needy children of New York City. And he still saw a need for children to have individual care, not just for their physical needs, but for their spiritual needs. These children needed their own parents to instill good morals into them if they were going to grow up to be good citizens. And this is when Brace had a revolutionary idea. He would find each child their own family. New York didn't have the resources to support these children, but there were many farmers in the West that could certainly use an extra hand. Brace believed that removing homeless children from the street environment and overcrowded cities' institutions and placing them with morally upright farming families was the key to providing the children with good lives. So Brace thought, you look at these farms, they have plenty of food, but they have a practical need for workers in these developing Western states to keep the farms going. Brace wrote, "In every American community, especially in the Western one, there are many spare places at the table of life. They have enough for themselves and for the stranger too." So he proposed to sending homeless children to these communities in hopes of finding them families. Now, another little interesting side note you probably know, but what they called the West back then are the areas that we now consider to be the Midwest and parts of the South. And now, of course, this was going to be a huge undertaking. So to test his idea out, Brace spent the first year sending children individually to nearby farms in places like Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and rural New York. And in September 1854, the CAS mounted its first large-scale expedition to the Midwest. During that time, the quickest and safest way to travel long distances was by railroad. So the idea was that a representative from CAS would take a group of children on a train and place them with a loving family who would raise them as their own, providing them with the care and education they needed to become productive members of society. In return, the family would gain an extra pair of hands to help with farming and household chores. It was seen as a win-win situation, a way to solve the problem of urban poverty while also meeting the labor needs of rural America. During this time, the CAS called this process placing out, and others called them baby trains or mercy trains. They wouldn't be called orphan trains until many years later. Now, of course, this idea Brace had sounded extremely simple, but It really was a massive undertaking, and the CAS began organizing this massive relocation effort in what would become the beginning of the foster care system in America. In 1869, the New York Foundling Hospital, founded by Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbons of the Sisters of Charity, opened a home and began life-saving efforts reserved for infants, young children, and unmarried women. The very first day that this institution opened, they received an infant on their doorstep. So as they began to see how big the problem was as well, in May of 1873, the New York Foundling also began sending children to Catholic families in Maryland and later to other states in the West and South, and their trains were known as baby trains and baby specials. With the combined effort of these two largest agencies, the New York Children's Aid Society, CAS, and the New York Foundling Hospital, along with placements from Boston and other East Coast cities, this relocation effort would ultimately transport an estimated 250,000 children from the East Coast to the Midwest over a period of 75 years from 1854 to 1929. These trains became the largest mass migration of children ever to take place on American soil. Trains typically departed from New York City after having gathered children from various orphanages, almshouses, and just all over the streets. And many of these children had already endured unimaginable hardships, losing their parents to disease or poverty, being abandoned by families who could no longer care for them, or simply being led to fend for themselves in a city that had little to offer the poor. The children were often given a bath, new clothes, and a small suitcase to carry their belongings, if they had any. Most only had the clothes on their backs. They were then placed on trains bound for towns across the Midwest where they would be met by prospective adoptive parents. Sometimes children who still had one living parent and had been sent out would insist that they could not leave. They wanted to stay near their family. Other children were on the streets or in orphanages because their parents were sick in the hospital. And in many of these cases, the children would beg and plead not to be taken on the train because their parent was going to return for them. Sadly, these children were not given a choice and were forced onto the trains into a new life. Now, sometimes their journey would only be a few days train ride, but other times these trains would travel for weeks. Prior to leaving town, the CAS would ride ahead, letting the town know they were coming and telling prospective parents when and where to show up to select a child. Upon arriving at their destination, the children would often be lined up in a local church or town hall where they would be inspected by the local families, much like livestock at an auction. The strongest and healthiest children were often chosen first, while those who were sick or disabled were often left behind or sent to the next town in hopes of finding a family willing to take them in. And this process of children being put up on a stage for the parents to select a child is where we get our modern term of a child being put up for adoption. Of course, this part of the process has been strongly criticized, as the way these children were put up on the stage was much like, I said, a livestock auction or even like a slave auction would have been conducted. These prospective parents would come up on the stage, they'd have the kids open their mouths so they could make sure they had good teeth. They would feel the muscles in their arms to see if they were strong enough to do farm labor, and sometimes they would have them lift up their pant legs or their skirts so they could see if their legs were straight. Essentially, some of these people were only there for farm laborers, so they wanted to make sure they got a healthy worker. Now, the Foundling Hospital had a different process for placing children, which I would say is probably a little bit better. They would send out notices to these towns that they had children available for adoption and have parents write back and select a child prior to sending them out on the train. So, I mean, it's still kind of funny to be like they were ordering a kid, but at least this seems a little less dehumanizing than the way that CAS was doing it. Once a child had been selected by a parent, they would assign a number for that child. The parent would be written with their child's number, and then when they would show up at the destination, they would have their number pinned on their shirt and also the parent that had selected them's name pinned on their shirt. But even though, like I said, they kind of had a bit less humiliating way of doing things, it still wasn't perfect because while they were supposed to be vetting these parents to make sure they were good fits for the kids, many kids were really just given to anyone who was willing to take them. And some parents would actually write in requests that they wanted a blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy, or they wanted a girl with a sweet disposition and curly black hair. And they would basically fill their order and send the kid to them. Now, the Foundling home would only adopt kids out to Catholic parents because they were a Catholic organization. You had to claim to be a Catholic for them to send you a kid. So to them, maybe that was a bit of a vetting process because if you're truly a Catholic, you should have certain morals. So maybe that's what they were thinking. But honestly, there wasn't a lot of follow-up, and they really just needed people to take these kids, and so it does seem like they really gave them to anybody as long as they claimed to be a Catholic. Now, the CAS did have a process for trying to make sure that the children were placed in the right families. Even though most kids were never officially adopted, they had a contract that the parents had to sign about how they would take care of the children. They were required to feed them and put them in schooling, and depending on how old they were, determined how much schooling they were required to give them. One of the stipulations is that the children were supposed to be treated as any other child in the family, and older children were to receive wages for the work they did while living with their new family. Unfortunately for teenage kids, most people didn't want the older kids because they were worried that they were too set in their ways and they wouldn't be able to train them. And in the beginning, CAS would have an agent that would visit their placements once a year and have a child write to them twice a year to kind of just update them on how things were going, to make sure they were being treated well by the people who took them in. And if they weren't, they would be moved to new families. Parents were supposed to write CAS if they were having an issue with a placement. If the child wasn't working out, they would move the child to a different home. So there are stories of children who were moved around 3 to 5 times before finding a home where they stayed or just getting to an age where they just had to find a way to live on their own. Now, even with all of these things they tried to put in place, they were kind of just figuring it out as they went along. But as you can imagine, over time, the scale of this operation meant that some children fell through the cracks, as sadly they still do in our modern foster care system. And while there are many amazing, heartwarming stories of children who rode these trains, they were placed with loving families who took them in and treated them as their own, just as Brace had intended. There were also many who saw these children simply as manual laborers or even slaves. Worse yet, some children were treated horribly and even abused. Born in 1859, Mary Ellen Wilson was one of the early riders of the Orphan Train. She was just a toddler when she was placed on one of these trains bound for the Midwest. Her early life was one of neglect and abuse, and she was placed with a family who treated her as little more than a servant, forcing her to do heavy labor and subjecting her to frequent beatings. By the time she was discovered by social workers at the age of 9, Mary Ellen was severely malnourished, scarred from the abuse, and unable to speak coherently due to the trauma she had endured. Her case became one of the first to draw public attention to the abuse of children and led to the creation of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the very first organization of its kind dedicated to protecting children from abuse and neglect. Mary Ellen's story helped to spark a movement that would eventually lead to stronger child protection laws and a greater awareness of the need to safeguard vulnerable children. But Mary Ellen's story was just one of many. There were countless other children whose experiences on the orphan train were equally harrowing. Some were separated from their siblings and never saw them again. Others were passed from family to family, never finding a place where they truly belonged. The impact of the orphan train movement extended far beyond the lives of the individual children involved. It had a profound effect on the communities that received these children, and it played a significant role in shaping the development of child welfare practices in the United States. Lee Nilling was another train rider, and his story was written up in a book that I read getting ready for this, and it was a sweet story, but I found a summary of the book that was written in poem form by Pippa White that explains his story beautifully. So I'm going to share that with you now in her words. But before I do, just a little side note, Lee had a brother named Leo, so just keep that in mind so that you don't get confused.
So I'm going to tell you a story, typical and true, kind of things these kids went through. This is a story of a boy named Lee from upstate New York, about 1923. He was 6 years old then, one of 7. Mama died in childbirth, went to heaven. Papa couldn't cope, one thing and another. I can't farm all day and then be a mother. So to the oldest 3, he just said, go. You're on your own. You can get a job, you know. The infant and the 2-year-old he took to a friend, but Lee and brother Leo to the orphanage did send. Lee said he belonged to a family one day, the next to an institution, cold and gray, with stern, unfriendly adults. Strict was the norm, not enough food, and seldom warm. 2 years of that with public school, where he was teased and taunted, orphan fool. A life so lonely, bleak and sad. Lee developed a temper, short and bad. 2 years of that. Then lo and behold, you're going on a train, these kids were told. You're going on a train to a new mom and dad. You're getting a family. Aren't you glad? Well, no, thought Lee. I've got a dad. My own family home is what I want so bad. But what could he do at age 8 or 9? Nothing to do but toe the line. Strange thing happened, though, when he was boarding that train. Whom should he meet but his dad again, with the baby brother, now 4 years old, and a pink envelope, or so I'm told. This here's your brother, Gerald's his name. Look after Leo and Gerald the same. In this envelope is my address. Write to me when you all get out west. So Lee was ecstatic, said nothing's wrong. My dad'll come and get us before ere long. Said to the chaperone, see this envelope here? It's from my father, he said with a tear. So he slept that night to the clickety-clack, not a worry or a care. He'd soon be back with his brothers and older sis, back with his father. He was sure of this. But in the morning, the envelope wasn't there. He searched in his pockets, under the seat, everywhere. And the chaperone said, you must forget your past. And 9-year-old Lee was simply aghast. Lee could just feel his temperature rise, anger and bitterness at adults' lies. She had taken that envelope, that much he knew, and there wasn't a thing a little kid could do. The train traveled for miles, made several stops, where some lucky kids got moms and pops. Then they landed in Texas, tired and beat, were marched to a church on aching feet. And people came and people chose. I'll take this girl, I'll call her Rose. Maybe I'll take 2, a he and a she. Oh no, thought Lee, will anyone want 3? And then a couple chose Gerald, and he fell in their arms. But when they got to the door, he turned in alarm. I want my brothers, he cried. You could hear the fear. Nothing to do but hold back the tear. And then a couple chose Leo. Lee thought he would die. Take my brother too, pleaded Leo with a cry. And the man and his wife, they exchanged a long glance. Yes, they said, we'll take that chance. So I'm going to warn you right now, though things seem pretty fine, Leo was happy, but Lee still pined. For the envelope, a future with his dad. Leo was okay, but Lee pretty bad. So he sulked and he moped and he would kind of brood. He wasn't polite, he was downright rude. But what could he do, and where did he belong, and why did everything always seem so wrong? The chaperone came and took Lee away. They can only handle one, so Leo will stay. I've got another family that's going to take you. Cheer up, Lee, don't look so blue. Lee didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to Leo, his brother. I don't know why. Placed with another family, he made a childish mistake, got moved again like so much freight. Now, if you're beginning to think, I've had enough of a story about a kid who had it so rough, Bear with me, folks, it gets better, I swear. Lee had a journey to take, and he's almost there. Almost. For now he was miserable. Things couldn't be worse. He hated everyone. His life was cursed. He was a nobody, a fool, a loser, a cad. He hated everyone. Life was just plain bad. Placed with another couple, he was quiet and glum. All adults were heartless, mean and dumb. He'd run away at dawn's first light. No, he'd run away in the middle of the night. The woman took him upstairs, said, "This is your room. Look out the window, you can see the moon. Now I'll tuck you in and you sleep tight." Then she kissed him on the cheek and said, "Good night." A kiss, a kiss. Had anyone ever kissed Lee? A kiss, a kiss. Who'd want to kiss me? Tears came to his eyes, they started to flow. He cried half the night, but Lee didn't go. Next morning, though, he was angry again. He'd run away the next night. They were not his ken. He'd run to his father. He'd run anywhere. No one ever had or ever would care. But breakfast smelled good, and he was a hungry child. And when he reached for a biscuit, in a voice so mild, the woman said, "We say grace first here. Close your eyes and fold your hands, my dear." Well, Lee was hungry, so he did obey. But what did he hear? What did they say? "Thank you, Lord, for we feel such joy that you have brought us this special boy." And the prayer went on. It didn't end there. "Thank you, God, that he's in our care. What a privilege to have a child to raise, a child to brighten all our days." He couldn't believe it. They're thankful for me, thankful for sullen, angry Lee, thankful to have him in their home, thankful to call him all their own. After breakfast, to town, to go to the store, new shoes, new clothes, a haircut, and more. Now there's the school, and there's the square, and there's the park right over there. Now, we know you've got 2 brothers here, too. You'll see them often, we promise you. Now, we want you to meet a neighbor, a friend. Next stop is right around this bend. Lee was stunned, didn't know what to feel. Were they sincere, honest, real? Should he give these people a try? Something felt right. He didn't know why. "I can see my brothers." That's what they'd said. And they said they had a pet for him, a dog named Red. A house, a home, parents, a pet. Maybe he wouldn't run just yet. Lee thought of the orphanage, New York, his past. And now here he was in Texas, so vast. All his family in New York were working on their own. Who was more likely to give Lee a real home? He looked in their faces, from him to her. If he ran, it would hurt them, that's for sure. He thought of the kiss, the promise, the prayer. And for the first time in his life, Lee realized maybe grown-ups can care. They took his hands, and he walked between on what was becoming the most beautiful day he had ever seen. Because to every person they met, they said to everyone, "We'd like you to meet Lee, Lee, our son."
Now, when Lee Schilling was an old man, he said that he honestly felt that that couple didn't just change his life, but they had saved his life. He said that when he stepped off that train, he wasn't just a sad and lonely little boy. He was a very angry, bitter little boy. And he said he's not sure what path he would have taken if it hadn't been for that couple. And he said they showered him with so much love. He said, "I just couldn't fight back." In many rural communities, the arrival of the orphan trains was met with a mix of curiosity, excitement, and at times suspicion. The idea of bringing children from the city, many of whom were perceived as unruly or morally compromised, was controversial. But for others, especially those who were unable to have children of their own or who had lost children, the orphan train represented an opportunity to build a family. Of course, as with many well-intentioned social experiments, the reality of the Orphan Train movement was far more complicated than its creators had anticipated. The children who boarded these trains were often frightened, confused, and unsure of what awaited them at the end of their journey. Many were told they were going on an adventure, that they would find new families who would take care of and love them. The experiences of these children varied wildly. Some were adopted into loving families and went on to lead happy and successful lives. Others were mistreated, abused, or abandoned yet again. While many families genuinely wanted to adopt and care for these children, others saw them as little more than free labor. Children who were not legally adopted were often treated as hired help, working long hours on farms or in households with little to no education or care. Today, the Orphan Train movement is seen as a bold social experiment. Most of the approximately 250,000 children who were sent away on the Orphan Train between 1853 to 1929 grew up to do very well for themselves. The children who were adopted and integrated into these communities often became contributing members of society, helping to build and sustain the agricultural economy of the Midwest. Some of them went on to be teachers, farmers, business owners, and there were even a couple of future governors among the Orphan Train children. While some children were never able to fully integrate into the communities where they were placed and continue to face ongoing discrimination and stigma, particularly if they were perceived as outsiders or if they struggled to adapt to their new rural environment. While there were times that the placement didn't work out and its shortcomings are obvious and often criticized, the program is considered by most historians to have been largely successful. Researchers agree that for most, their fate was much better than it would have been had they been left on the streets of New York City. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Orphan Train movement was the loss of identity experienced by many of the children. In an era before modern record keeping and social services, many children were separated from their siblings, given new names, and lost all connection to their past. For some, the Orphan Train represented not just a physical journey, but the insurer of their entire identity. But perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the Orphan Train movement is the conversation it sparked about the rights and needs of children. The movement forced society to confront the reality that children, regardless of their social or economic status, deserve to be cared for, protected, and given the opportunity to thrive. The Orphan Train movement also had a significant influence on the development of the child welfare policies in the United States. It highlighted the need for better systems to protect vulnerable children and to ensure that they were placed in safe, nurturing environments. Over time, the movement led to the establishment of more formal adoption processes, greater oversight of child placements, and the eventual development of foster care systems. The program only stopped when it did because of the onset of the Great Depression, when having an extra child was just not feasible for most families. During this time, new child labor laws were being passed, which limited the number of hours a child could work in the day, and more organized and better run state care options like group homes and foster care were available to needy children, not just in New York City, but in every single state. Now, the main criticism that we get nowadays of the Orphan Train movement was the way the children were put up in front of these parents like a slave auction, and the way that siblings who went on trains together were not kept together. They were allowed to be chosen by different families. And the way that all of these vetting processes and ways of following up with the kids kind of trickled out over time, and so it just made it easier for these children to be placed in homes where they weren't treated the best or even abused. And a lot of the kids ended up not getting the education and job training that CAS had promised they would get in this placements. Some children ran away either because of abuse or because farm life was too different from what they were used to in the city. But in spite of these issues with the program, the orphan trains were by far and large a success, and the children who traveled on them benefited from the new lives they were given. Charles Loring Brace is now considered the father of modern foster care. Now, it wasn't until their golden years that a lot of these train riders found out they were part of such a large movement. A lot of them thought that their train was the only train. They just thought, I just happened to be part of this group of kids that were taken on this train to a new home. But when they were in their older years and they started to piece things together, they started to realize how big this program really had been, and Orphan Train writers started having reunions and sharing their stories. In the 1990s, roughly 500 train writers were still alive, but all of them were in their 70s or older. And by the early 2000s, only a handful remained. Now, if there are any train writers still alive in 2024, they would have to be at least 95 at the youngest, so they might be some of the ones that were sent as infants, so they probably wouldn't be able to share much. But of course, we do have a lot of interviews that were done like in the 80s and 90s and put to video of their stories. So if you do a search, you can find some of these train writers telling their side of the story, what they remember and what they went through. Experts estimate that there are at least 2 million direct descendants of riders. So this story might be your family's story. Many orphan riders passed through Ellis Island with their families before they were orphaned. So I do have a link for Ellis Island's passenger database that you can search. This allows you to search your family's name and look at the passengers' records and ship manifest. So check it out. Maybe your grandparent or great-grandparent was one of these kids. If you are a descendant of a train rider and you're watching this on YouTube, I would love to hear their stories in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed today's video, you'll love some of these episodes about some of the other horrible situations that people came up with prior to modern day adoption.